Okay, so if you remember the last time, we got to this to introduce this experiment by Lütke et al. 2008 about negation, right? And yeah, so this experiment is actually nice also because it kind of introduces the topic of the debate in the literature about whether negation is processed in one step or two steps, or one stage or in two stages, right? So just to summarize this, the two stages models predict that you first simulate the negated content, so the content of what you are negating, and then you compare your simulation with the real scenario, for instance, in a verification task, and you want to make sure that the real scenario mismatches the simulated content because there is a negation. But then alternative models maintain that actually you immediately integrate the compositional meaning of negation, and you don't have to simulate the positive representation of the content of negation in order to get the meaning of the negated content. Okay, so I'm gonna make you an example of this. Right, so let's say that our sentence is, in front of the tower there is a ghost. No negation, you mentally simulate a tower and a ghost, and then in the true affirmative condition you actually see a picture of a tower with a ghost. Compare this to the true negative, sorry, to the false affirmative. So it is exactly the same sentence. In your mind you're simulating a tower with a ghost, but then what you see is a tower with a lion. So there is a mismatch between the way you interpret the sentence and what actually is depicted in the picture that you have to, against which you have to verify the sentence, okay? So here you would have a mismatch. Okay, so nothing fancy at this point. Now let's take a sentence with negation, like in front of the tower, there is no ghost, right? So here, the two-step model of negation predicts that you would first represent a tower with a ghost, and then you know that that is false. So then after that, you make another representation with a tower without a ghost, okay? And then if your picture has a lion in front of the tower, that's perfectly compatible with the meaning of negation, so you're happy. However, in the fourth condition, which is a false negative, again, there is a negation. You simulate a tower with a ghost, then you simulate a tower without ghost, but actually in the picture there is a tower with a ghost. So, surprise. So, what is the difference between the the two steps or two stages and the one stage model of negation is that in the one stage model, you don't have to simulate a tower with the ghost in order to represent the meaning of negation. So you immediately create your mental representation with a tower without a ghost, okay? So you know immediately that you don't have to represent a ghost. So you actually deactivate whatever kind of representation of a ghost you have, and you immediately represent the tower without a ghost. Now, these two different models make different predictions, okay? So if you have a two stages model of negation, then you basically represent a ghost in front of the tower, no matter whether there is a negation in the sentence or not, okay? And then you should have an effect of priming. When you have this effect of priming, you should have an effect of priming in the conditions where you actually see a tower with a ghost. So in the true affirmative and in the false negative, okay? It's false because the sentence says that there is no ghost, right? It's negative because there is a negation, and it's false because in the picture you do actually have a ghost, okay? But according to these models, you should be actually quite good in this condition because you did represent a ghost and you and you do have a ghost in the picture. So it doesn't really matter what, whether in a way the resulting meaning gets rid of the ghost, because you have represented that. Right. So even in this condition that's supposed to be very hard because it's negative and because it's false, you should be actually quite good. And then in general, when you do integrate the meaning of negation in your mental representation, you should have an effect, a higher processing for the false condition, because no matter how you represented the meaning of negation, no matter whether the sentence was negative or positive, once you see something that mismatches the meaning that you have mentally simulated, then you should have a sort of a surprisal effect, okay? So you see something that you were not expecting, because you would always expect to have the true sentence, okay? Okay, so yeah, so here's the thing, right? So here's the results. So this an experiment was done in German. So it was von den Turm ist ein Geist, or von den Turm ist kein Geist. So in front of the tower there is a ghost, there is no ghost, okay? And that's what they found immediately at the onset of the word ghost. So immediately they found a frontal negativity at about 300 milliseconds on the noun after the negation compared to the affirmative condition, okay? So here you haven't seen the pictures yet. You haven't seen anything. You're just listening to the sentence or reading the sentence, okay? I don't remember if this was presented auditorily or in a written form. It doesn't really matter, right? The idea is that the mere presence of negation gives you a sort of a processing difference, okay, which is arguably sort of an increased processing in order to process negation syntactically and semantically, okay? So negation gives you this effect by itself. So this syntax is some early linguistic processing of negation, cool, right? And then what happens? So in this experiment, they had an interesting manipulation. They gave two different delays, okay, between the end of the sentence and the presentation of the picture that you had to verify. So the one was a short delay of 300 milliseconds, so very, very, very fast. And the other one was like, I think 1 second, 1 second and a half. And the idea is that if representing the meaning of negation takes time, you should have effects depending on the truth condition of the sentence only with a long delay. Because in the short delay, you don't actually have time to represent the meaning of negation and to integrate it in the context. If instead you do everything in one stage, then you should have, you know, truth value based effects. So truth effects in both conditions, okay? So this is a typical psychological manipulation that tells you, I'm going to give you more time for processing stuff. If actually the fact that I give you more time is going to help you, that means that the representation you're processing requires time, okay? And that's what they found. So with short delays, they found this N400 for not prime or not mentioned condition. So for the false positive and the true negative, okay? So again, this is when you actually at the end of the day, you see a lion in front of the ghost or in front of the tower, but the sentence you read, regardless of the presence of negation, included the noun lion, okay? Oh, again, included the noun ghost. So the sentence was, there is a ghost, or there is no ghost, and you see a lion, N400, okay? And you see, this is the N400, a negative deflection at about 400 milliseconds. And here as well, for these two conditions, so the true negative and false affirmative, okay? False affirmative and true negative. Okay. So this is this effect is manifested as a truth negation interaction, okay? Meaning that, again, false positive and true negative are the most negative conditions. Now, what happens at the long delay, which was actually 1.5 seconds, okay? So you hear there is a ghost in front of a tower, or there is no ghost in front of a tower. Then you have 1.5 seconds, and then you see the picture. Now, they got the same effect of N400 for non-primed conditions. So they got the same truth negation interaction, but also main effect of negation and the main effect of truth, okay? So given that you only found this main effect of truth in the long delay and not in the short delay, this suggests, according to the authors, that if you have 1.5 seconds of time to process negation, you actually sort of represent a full-fledged mental model of the sentence you read. And then you have a surprisal effect affecting the N400, whether the picture mismatches the meaning of the sentence, okay? And not just the mentioned object in the sentence. So you see, here you don't have these two conditions patterned together, but you have this kind of degree of different N400. And specifically, if you run a statistical analysis, you get all these nice effects, okay? So yeah, so at long delays, negation was integrated in the interpretation of the sentence. And they took this as a support for the two-stage model. So the frontal negativity index some just general processing of negation, right? That leads you to simulate the negated content. And then right after, you can compare the negated content to the real scenario. And you get this truth negation interaction in all condition because just of the effect of priming of the word ghost. But if you have a long delay, then you actually have time to process negation to integrate it in the meaning of the sentence, and then you can get the main effect of negation and the main effect of truth only with long delays, because it is only in this condition that you can actually build a real representation of the sentence, even of a negative sentence, and then to compare the negated content to a real scenario, okay? So not just the positive content, which is the argument of negation, but the result of applying negation to that content, okay? And yeah, so big debate in literature about whether this is true or not. In some other experiments, they found that actual negation might affect the processing of the sentence immediately, not just because of negation itself, but also because of the meaning of negation. So, you know, there is debate. In other experiments, they found that when you have negation applied to action verbs, like I kicked the ball compared to I didn't kick the ball, you have an immediate inhibition of the processing in your motor cortex. So as soon as you hear negation, some people claim that you immediately inhibit the cortex that is responsible for the movement of denoted by the verb that you're reading. So, you know, there might be different effects, there might be different kind of processing streams going on at the same time. And, you know, there is debate in the literature. Okay, so here's the other experiment that I wanted to talk to you about. So this experiment that I did a few years ago, and then we wrote this paper with Romoli, and it's about NPIs, okay? So here's an example. What are NPIs? NPIs are negative polarity items. So there are these words like any or ever that like negative contexts, okay? And it's not clear what they mean. For instance, any could be used interchangeably with indefinite. So if someone asks you, do you have potatoes? You might answer, no, I don't have a potato. I don't have potatoes, or I don't have any potato. And they kind of mean the same thing. So the idea is that the truth conditional content of any is just the same as a plain indefinite. So any is a. But then why do you have a word that means any, and especially what does any add to the sentence meaning compared to a plain indefinite, and why does any can only occur in certain contexts. So the idea is that any can actually attract, for instance, an emphatic focus. So if someone continues asking, you don't even have like a small potatoes, like sweet potatoes, like old potatoes, and you say, no, I don't have any potato, okay? So that's completely fine. But if you answer again, no, I don't have a potato, then you sound a little bit dumb, right? So there is this idea that any used in this context and also with an intonation emphasis is going to bring you a sort of a strengthening of the negative inference. And this is a problem for linguists, and they've been debating over that for half a century. So the emphatic use of any, the idea is that it excludes any more specific kind of potato in this sentence. It makes sure that any kind of potato that you might not have thought about in the very first answer are actually in the domain of the stuff that you want to negate. Okay. All right. So interesting. So what about ever? Okay. And what are the contexts in which ever can occur? There is another puzzle about that, and that comes from what has been called Ladusot generalization. So the idea is that NPIs do not only occur under negation, but also in other contexts, like for instance, covered negative context, like doubt, for instance, right? That doesn't have any explicit negation, but it is a sort of a negative verb. So I doubt that a man has ever set foot on the moon. Fine. No man has ever set foot on the moon. Fine. But also in a lot of non-negative contexts, like antecedents of conditionals, if a man has ever set foot on the moon, he would be a fan of the police. Every man who has ever set foot on the moon is famous. First argument of universal quantifier. Before a man had ever set foot on the moon, before a man had ever set foot on the moon, we thought it was an impossible venture. So, argument of before clauses. The moon is the farthest place on which an astronaut has ever walked. Comparatives. Have you ever set foot on the moon? Question. Okay. So there's no negation in any of these contexts. Well, maybe you might say that before has a sort of a cover negation, but certainly not every, not if, and definitely, I mean, it's not clear how questions have a negation, right? So what do these contexts have in common? Okay, except question, which is a little bit tricky. All the other contexts have in common that they are downward entailing. So they license entailment from sets to proper subsets. And this is a Ladusot generalization, okay? Now, I promised you that I will skip a little bit the formal details, so I'm just going to give you an example of how these things work, and then if you're interested, you can read papers. So let's take the set of the man taller than 190, okay? And let's take the broader set of the man, which includes the tall man, okay? So if you are a tall man, you're also a man, but if you're a man, we don't really know if you're a tall man or not, okay? Good. And this is, man can be intended in a gender neutral way. So like a member of human race. Okay, so now, if I tell you that no man has ever set foot on the moon, can you infer that no man taller than 190 centimeters has ever set foot on the moon? Yes or no? I would take it as a yes. In fact, yes, right? So this is an example of a downward entailing context, because it licenses this inference, this entailing inference, from a set of men to a proper subset of men, which is men taller than 190. Okay? You might say, yeah, cool. But what does this have to do with NPIs like ever? Well, the cool thing about this generalization is that it tells you that any context that respects, that whole this abstract logical property is actually a good context for licensing NPIs. And we can test this. So, right. So we can say, okay, is this going to work with every? We know that every actually is an NPI licenser. So we do the same trick. If I tell you every man who's ever set foot on the moon is famous, can you conclude that also every man taller than 190 who has ever set foot on the moon is famous? Yes, right? So cool, it works. Now, if we talk about downward entering contexts, it means that some other contexts do not have this property. And these are the non-downward entering contexts, or more specifically, the upward entering contexts, like just normal affirmative sentences. Let's check it again. So we should get the opposite inference, right? So we should say that a man that is taller than 190 has set foot on the moon. If I tell you this, can you conclude that a man has set foot on the moon? Yes or no?
Yes.
If I tell you a tall man has set foot on the moon?
Yes.
Yes. You can conclude that a man has set foot on the moon. Now let's try the other trick. If I tell you a man has set foot on the moon, can you conclude that a tall man has set foot on the moon? Can you conclude that the man I told you about is actually tall? No, right? It's not included in, it's not a warranted inference or a warranted implication out of what I told you. So you see, you cannot have inferences from a set to a proper subset unless you are in a downward entering context. The same way, you cannot have inference from a set to a proper to a superset, including the set, unless you are in an upward entering context. Okay. So the generalization is that only in downward entering context you can license NPIs. So if you say a man taller than 190 has ever set foot on the moon, you get an ungrammatical sentence. Okay. Now, the question is, well, first of all, why do NPIs behave this way? And also, why do you get ungrammaticality if this is a logical semantic property, right? And, in a few words, the idea is that this is actually an L-analytical sentence, meaning that it introduces an unavoidable contradiction. So a contradiction that is at the level of the logic form that you will get no matter which content words you're going to use, and no matter which kind of context you're going to evaluate the sentence in. Okay, it is a contradiction which is due to the word that you're using, basically, and there is no way to avoid it. And your parser hates this kind of contradictions, and it triggers ungrammaticality. Okay, right. So why do NPIs behave this way? The idea is that it's not an accidental property shared by every language in the world, because you can find this kind of words in every language, but it is the consequence of something deeper. Basically, the NPI distribution is determined by their meaning. The fact that they can only occur in this context, it is because of this property. But then again, why are they so picky? Why do you get this sort of logical contradiction if you use the NPIs in the wrong context? And I'm gonna just try to summarize this story by saying that NPIs might activate these sort of domain alternatives, which are like rotten potato, sus potato, small potato, all potato. So they lead you to widen your domain of predication, considering the most remote sets of entities that you might have not thought about. So, example, did any of your friends vote for Berlusconi? Okay. And you might have in mind, a domain of friends like John, Mary, Anna, and Paul. Okay. So the idea is that NPIs contain a covert only, or they work as if they had a covert only. Okay. And then they bring a conventional implicature. So the idea is that any alternative that you activate must be either entailed by the assertion, otherwise must be false. Okay. Now I'm going to skip the details of this and just give you the final example. So, right. So if you have a negative question like this, sorry, a negative sentence like this, like, no, someone asks you, have you ever voted for Berlusconi last elections? And you answer, no, I haven't voted for Berlusconi. Or, no, I haven't ever voted for Berlusconi. Whatever does is just to activate time intervals in which you could have voted for Berlusconi. So any preceding election, right? So any election prior to the 2013. And then you just, by the semantics of the indefinite, you say, okay, these are false, okay? And again, this would not be different from using a plain indefinite, right? But then, I mean, in this case, you don't have a plain indefinite because it's a temporal adverb, but that's, that's not a thing. Then the idea is that you sort of grind down this big domain of interval of times in which you could have voted for Berlusconi, and you grind it down considering any smallest possible domain that you have. Okay. So in the end, you end up considering one single time interval in which you had an election, right? And then you make sure that all these alternatives are entailed by the assertion. So ever means something like there exists at least a time interval, okay? It is under negation. So under negation means there is not a time interval in which I voted for Berlusconi. So this is already included in the plain semantics of the sentence. And then any smaller time interval is entailed by this semantic. So if you say there is no time in which I voted for Berlusconi, that entails that you haven't voted for Berlusconi in 96, that you haven't voted for Berlusconi in 2001, and then you haven't voted for Berlusconi last elections. Okay. So all these alternatives are entailed by the assertion. So that's fine. Then you don't do any mess, basically. However, so this is our entailing context, and again, every larger set entails a smaller set of alternatives because you apply negation to these sets. So this entails this, which in turn entails this, okay? Now, what happens if you have a positive sentence? So if you have ever occurring in an affirmative sentence, like I have ever voted for Berlusconi, which is bad. So what you're saying is this: there is at least an interval of time in which I have voted for Berlusconi. Might be last elections, might be in 96, might be in 2001. I'm not telling you, okay? I'm just telling you that in the history of elections, there is at least one interval of time in which I have voted for Berlusconi, okay? And then you do the same trick. So you activate your domain alternatives and you make sure that if these alternatives are not entailed by the original assertion, then they must be false, okay? And now you see the trick. if I tell you that there is at least an interval of time in which I voted for Berlusconi, this statement is not logically stronger than telling you that I voted for Berlusconi in the 96. It's the other way around, okay? It's just like a tall man walking on the moon and a man walking on the moon, okay? So this would be a man walking on the moon, and this would be a tall man walking on the moon. This is, I voted for Berlusconi at least once in my life, and this, I voted for Berlusconi in 96. And you see where the entailment direction goes. If it is true that I voted for Berlusconi in 96, it is true that I voted for Berlusconi at least once between 96 and 2001, and entails that it is true that I have voted for Berlusconi at least once in my life, right? Do you see this, right? So from a more specific to a less specific. Now, the semantics of the NPIs tell you that any alternative that is stronger must be negated. So you end up negating all these alternatives because they are all stronger than the assertion. So the meaning you end up with at the end of the day is something like this, formally speaking. There is a time t in my domain in which I did vote for Berlusconi, and for every specific subdomain alternative, for every specific time, it is false that I voted for Berlusconi in that time. So I'm telling you, I voted for Berlusconi once in my life, but that didn't happen in 96, didn't happen in 2001, didn't happen in 2006, didn't happen in 2008, didn't happen in 2013, it never happened. So I'm contradicting myself, okay? The idea is that you get an analytical contradiction, and this is why NPIs are bad in upward entailing context. So this idea comes from the work by Krivka, for instance, and then has been worked out by Kierkia and other people recently, okay? But it's originally something that was brought up by Krivka already in the end of the 90s. So it's kind of an old idea, and it works quite well. All right, so how to test this crazy formal semantic stuff with ERPs? Here's how. So we know that language-related mechanism must be implemented in real cognitive processes, right? And we know that we can study linguistic conflicts with ERPs, or any kind of conflict, in fact, like morphosyntactic conflicts, like, for instance, agreement violation, the child throw the toy versus the children throw the toy, okay? This is a plural marking, and this is a singular subject. So if you do this, you might remember from the last time, you get possibly a left anterior negativity, followed by very, very probably a P600, index of syntactic anomaly. But if you have what we might call a conceptual or a lexical conflict, like she spread the warm bread with butter compared to she spread the warm bread with socks, right? The other way around, sorry. She spread the warm bread with socks compared to she spread the warm bread with butter. You're not going to get probably a P600, but you are going to get a psychophysiological effect that indexes semantic anomaly. Do you remember what is the name of this wave? Can anyone tell me? I can't see the chat. Now I'm gonna pop it up. Okay. N400, yeah. Okay. The N400. Okay. So you see, you expect different effects with different kind of violations. Now, here's the point. NPIs like ever, any jemals, which means never in German, and mai, which means ever and never. Sorry, jemals means ever also in German, and mai means ever in Italian. They have been tested in a few experiments, like Seri et al. In 2004. A man with a beard was ever happy compared to no man with a beard was ever happy. Okay. So the idea is that, according to some theories, NPIs, they induce a violation of a linguistic rule, which is the rule of NPI licensing, right? So since they violate the grammar, we would expect they give rise to a P600 effect, but they actually give rise to N400 effect as well. Actually, in this experiment, they only found N400, and in this experiment, they found a biphasic pattern of N400 and P600. So the question is, why is this the case? And the explanation were that, you encounter an unexpected word because given that there is no negation, you do not expect to have an NPI, and then you have a lexical surprise or other effects like task-related effects, conflict monitoring, whatever. The problem is that, as I told you last time, these are sort of last resort explanations that are not really convincing, because if you do expect an N400 every time that you have an unexpected word, then you should get an N400 for any grammatical anomaly, for any syntactic anomaly, because any syntactic mismatch is induced by a word that you would never expect due to the fact that it's ungrammatical. Okay, so that's not a great explanation. Another better explanation that I like more is that the N400 could be actually the reflect of some sort of semantic logical violation, or could be the result of the semantic system to a semantic problem, but not of a conceptual extra-linguistic sort, but also of a purely logical problem. Okay, this was the working hypothesis. Right, so let's finally come to Italian. Italian is particularly cool because not only you have this fancy word that must occur under negation, okay? So they're called N words, which are kind of strong NPIs. So like, for instance, nessuno, niente means nothing, or anything, depending on whether it is, right? So basically, in post-verbal position, these words require negation to be licensed, okay? So un uomo non ha mai camminato sulla luna is fine because you have not. A man has not ever walked on the moon. But un uomo ha mai camminato sulla luna is bad. A man has ever walked on the moon is bad, okay? Because there is no negation. So just like NPIs. He also goes in questions. So here mine is really, really like ever. However, in Italian and in Romance languages, you have this special rule according to which, if these elements occur before the verb in preverbal position, they themselves introduce a negation. So here mine means never, okay? So if you say, un uomo mai ha camminato sulla luna, a man has never walked on the moon, now mai is fine, and it means never. So compare this to this. Sorry, to this. Here, you have no negation, mai occurs after the verb, and it's bad. Here, you have no negation, but mai occurs before the verb, and it's good, and it's negative. Here, it occurs after the verb, after negation, it is fine, and it does not introduce a double negation. It just keeps the negation introduced by non, and it means ever. Okay? So very, very strange behavior of mai, and in general, these kind of words in Romance languages. Now, mai has a further interesting property. So you might say, okay, but then mai is not an NPI. It's an N word, like nessuno, like niente, like all these words, right? Now, there is this particular property of mai, which I think it even makes it different from Spanish nunca, that it can use with a pure non-negative meaning. So if you say this, sorry, one step back. If you say, have you ever walked on the moon? Hai mai camminato sulla luna? Mai means ever. And there is no negation whatsoever in this sentence, okay? So it really means, have you at least once walked on the moon? And this is not, I mean, you can do that with the same with nessuno and niente, so with the real N words, but then you get a sort of a negative question meaning, okay? But then again, you might say, oh, yeah, but questions are also automatically negative, so this is not a great test. So let me introduce this other property. So the question is, what happens if my occurs in pre-verbal position, but in a downward entailing context? Is it gonna be interpreted in a negative way or in a positive way? Okay. I told you before that anytime that my occurs before negation, before the verb, it is negative, but actually that was wrong. So in this sentence, my occurs in pre-verbal position, but in a downward entailing context, and it is interpreted with a positive meaning. So if you say, se io mai dovessi andare sulla luna, mi porterei la crema solare, means if I was ever to go on the moon, I would bring the sun protection with me. Ogni uomo che mai sia stato sulla luna è diventato famoso. Every man who's ever been on the moon became famous. So what's going on here? The cool thing is that it is not the position of the verb alone, but also the semantics property of the context that determine whether my has to be interpreted positively or negatively, okay? So my means never, only when it's pre-verbal and in non-downward entailing context. It means ever otherwise, okay?
I have a question. So for example, in the D1, if we have my after dovessi, it would be the same. Or because, for example, I would have said my after dovessi if I normally speak, not.
Yeah, exactly. Good point. So we put it in pre-verbal position to check that actually it wouldn't have a negative interpretation, right? But if you say, se io andrò mai sulla luna, sarò felice, ok? Or same sentence, se io dovessi mai andare sulla luna, se io dovessi andare mai sulla luna, se io dovessi andare sulla luna mai, you can always, you can use it in all these different positions, right? It means the same. But that was predicted by standard theory, because in downward entailing context, it is always existential. So here I'm giving you one more piece of information, which is that even pre-verbally, if it is in a downward entailing context, it is not negative. Okay. So the idea is there is a sort of a switch in your brain that monitors the logical property of the context, and then based on this, it's gonna decide whether to introduce a negation or not. Okay, this is kind of the The idea is that how the hell does the parser know when my is to be interpreted as never and when it has to be interpreted as ever? What is gonna tell our parser that my means never in that particular context, right? And on what kind of information does the parser rely, and when is the information is accessed? So clearly I'm pointing at the answer to this question, that the information that the parser relies on is the logical property of the embedding context, whether it's downward entailing or not. But when the parser accesses information, it's completely a mystery, right? We have no idea. So we run this experiment. Was this clear? Did I answer your question? Okay. Any other question? Okay, so right. So here's our design. We have a control sentence where we have my after negation. So the coach believed that the boy would not ever play under the rain. Il mister credeva che I ragazzi non avrebbero mai giocato sotto la pioggia. NPI violation, same sentence without negation. The coach believed that the boys would ever play under the rain. Il mister credeva che I ragazzi avrebbero mai giocato sotto la pioggia. Ungrammatical. Okay? Ungrammatical because my it's post-verbal and with no negation. And then we had the pre-verbal condition. Exactly mirror picture of this. So preverbal mai without negation is fine because mai introduces its own negation. So the coach believed that the boys would never play under the rain. Il mister credeva che i ragazzi mai avrebbero giocato sotto la pioggia. And as a bonus, I tell you that in this position, it is very emphatic in Italian. So you have to use focus. It is completely fine, but it's marked, okay? And then to conclude, I mean, to complete the picture, we also had, we wanted to introduce a pre-verbal occurrence with my and negation. So we decided to use this non-my thing, which is very bad in Italian. It's completely out, but it was used in the Italian spoken in the 17th century. So it's not completely crazy, ok? Il mister credeva che i ragazzi non mai avrebbero giocato sotto la pioggia. So it is pre-verbal, but it is a violation because there is a negation in a position that probably syntactically is out. They compete for the same position in this situation, okay? All right, so now we have two hypotheses. So in one hypothesis, which I call the perfect system, the parser knows whether my is in a downward entering environment or not before interpreting it, okay? So you get this, you get the words, you get the coach believe that the boys would, ta-dam, never, my, before the verb, non-downward entering environment, add negation. But then there is, right, so it performs the right interpretation, negative in a non-DE and positive in a DE. But there is an alternative hypothesis, which is the imperfect system. And if you want to read something interesting about ideas of imperfection at the interface, Reinhardt book 2000, it's amazing. It's a must read if you're interested in these topics. I guess the title is interface strategy and something else. So in an imperfect system, the parser does not know immediately whether you are in a downward entering context or in an upward entering context. Okay, it doesn't have a sort of RAM memory that stores the information about the monotonicity of the context. Okay, monotonicity means whether you're upward or downward entering, because downward entering also means downward monotonic. Okay, so in this case, what could it do? It could perform an interpretation of my, and then it could add a negation if this interpretation yields an error. So this is a sort of a repair strategy. So try your preferential interpretation first as an NPI. If that gives error, then try to repair this problem by adding your self-licensing negation, okay? So, you know, anything could come out of this. But these allow us to make two clear predictions. In a perfect system, if you compare, if you think about the NPI violation and the control, right? And if you compare that to a preverbal my and a control, you predict that you should have two completely different processes. So in the preverbal negative use of my, you have no clash, no problem, no fixing. All you have to do is to add a negation. In an NPI violation, you have the cost of dealing with the semantic clash. You try to fix it, and then you cannot fix it, basically, because the rules of the language does not allow you to fix this, okay? So this should give rise to two completely different effects. However, in an imperfect system, these two conditions have something in common. They share something in common, which is the cost of dealing with a semantic clash. If that is the information that your parser uses in order to introduce a negation as a repair strategy, at some point there should be an overlap between the NPI violation and the correct preverbal use of mine. And then, yes, you have to add a negation here. So then you have to do something else, but there should be some kind of common path, okay? Is this clear? These two hypotheses? Okay, so, and then we have this condition, which is explorative, and I'm not gonna go into these details. So I'm just gonna give you the results, okay? So this is, now you should be a little bit more familiar with this kind of ERP waves. Now, this is very nice because you see the timing here, you see the millivolts, negativity is plotted upwards, and this is the frontal electrode, okay? So in the frontal electrode, you should know that what you can find is, for instance, this sort of early negativities like LAN, ELAN, or frontal positivities, like the frontal P600, that if you remember was part of the broadly distributed P600 that Friederici found for the focus fronting sentence in German with a complex verb compared to the simple tense, okay? So syntactic complexity. Now, guess what? We found it as well. So first of all, you see a beautiful N400 even earlier than what you would expect. So this is the usual peak of the N400, in fact, 400 milliseconds. Ours was peaking more at 300, 350, okay? And then you see this nice pattern, which is sort of indexing an interaction. So you have the maximum N400 for the pre-verbal mai, so for a grammatical sentence. For i ragazzi mai avrebbero giocato sotto la pioggia. The boys would never play under the rain, okay? So biggest N400 here, smallest N400 in the control, so would not ever play, non avrebbero mai giocato, and then to intermediate N400 in the two conditions of violation, basically, including a violation. So in the one condition where you have no licensor and mai is post-verbally, and in the other condition where mai is pre-verbally, but in a ungrammatical sentence because you have non-mai generating this grammaticality, okay? This sort of syntactic and grammaticality. So, okay, and then we move forward in time and we find a P600. So you see now, you also see how a biphasic pattern is revealed. So this is more negative because it's upwards, and this is more positive because it's downwards, okay? So now all your experimental conditions are more positive than the control. And now the two violations are more positive than the pre-verbal mai, but I mean, they're actually kind of the same in the analysis. So all these three conditions are more positive than the control condition, okay? So frontal P600 for all the violations and the pre-verbal mai, and N400 maximum for the pre-verbal mai and then for the violations, okay? This is just the frontal electrode. Now, if you move to the posterior electrodes, the N400 is just there because it's distributed centrally, but you also see the P600, the posterior P600, which is expected for the ungrammatical condition, and that's exactly where we find it. Now, there are two beautiful things to appreciate here. Again, the interaction in the N400 with the maximum effect for the grammatical condition, but also the fact that in the posterior P600, you have the two anomalous condition patterned together, but now the pre-verbal mai condition, which is in fact grammatical, does not give you a posterior P600. And this is good because this is a grammatical sentence. So you would not expect it to give you a sign of ungrammaticality. But it's also good because this dissociates this classic P600 in posterior electrodes from the frontal P600 in anterior electrodes, because you see that here, all these three conditions are more positive than the control. But here, the two grammatical conditions are close to each other, and the two ungrammatical conditions are more positive. Okay? So, how to make sense of this? Oh yeah, and this is the central electrode, which is my favorite because you can see everything basically. You can see the M400, the frontal P600, and the posterior P600, but yeah. Okay, so to sum up, the NPI violation behaves just like the preverbal violation. And this is already kind of crazy. And they have this triphasic pattern with N400, frontal P600, and posterior P600. The preverbal my, which is a grammatical sentence, larger the maximum N400, the frontal P600, but non-posterior P600. Okay, so how can we make sense of this? Here's how. Based on on the assumptions that we can make if we buy this sort of conventional implicature idea that NPIs have this implicature that makes sure that all the alternatives must be entailed. Okay, and if that is not the case, then you get the contradiction. In your grammatical control, what happens? You get negation, right? You interpret my, and then you don't get a contradiction. You're fine. You stop. In the preverbal my, you interpret my in an upward entailing context because you don't have any negation. So you are at I ragazzi mai avrebbero, because believe that the boys would never. Okay. So you do get a contradiction because you are in an upward entailing context. But then the beauty of your Romance language would give you the possibility of repairing this problem. So with a sort of a grammatical reanalysis, which is reflected in the biphasic pattern N400 and frontal P600. And maybe the N400 is related to the contradiction, which happens first, and the reanalysis is indexed by the frontal P600, as it has been found in other studies, where you had some sort of syntactically or discourse-triggered reanalysis, okay? So the outcome of this reanalysis is to add a negation, success, you're fine. However, if you have a real NPI violation, you try to fix this problem, but you don't get any success because the rules of your language does not allow you to add a negation if my occurs post-verbally, okay? So there is no way you can fix this. So the last resource is just to break down your sentence and give up and say, okay, this is bullshit. My speaker is really saying something that is completely out. I have to correct it, okay? And then you get the P600, just as you said, the child throw the toys, okay? So whether this is true or not, I don't know, but at least it's a nice way to think about what could happen. And, there is some kind of evidence from other studies, but, you might say that it's too speculative. Who knows? Right. And the interesting thing is that you get exactly the same thing for the preverbal violation, which has a completely different structure. So there are some models, for instance, that are based on some Q retrieval mechanism. So they claim that NPI licensing is really the search in your working memory of a good licensor. You hit my, you look for none in your working memory, and if you get it, it's fine. The further away it is in your speech stream or in your sentence, the more you have to struggle to get this licensor, but when you find it, you're good, okay? Good. These models don't work in account for our data because in this condition, the licensor is adjacent to the NPI. So it should be super easy to repair this because none is right there, right? You're looking for a licensor, you have it there. It's just not in the right grammatical position. So, for instance, this sort of working memory-based model would predict that this should be easier compared to a NPI violation where you don't have negation, but we got exactly the same results, okay? Of course, it's not easy to explain how you get these 3 ways for something that looks like a syntactic anomaly. But what you can say is that since you haven't gotten the verb, negation by itself did not manage to create a suitable downward entailing context. So you still have a violation, you still have a semantic violation, and then you try to repair it, you cannot repair it, it's even worse because the position in which you have to put negation is already occupied, so it's a problem. If you want to know some more details about this, look up my paper, okay? In Panizza and Romoli, we have a nice formal description of why you try to move my higher in the structures and there is already none there, and then you don't know what to do, basically, okay? Cool. Other evidence that things could be like this, again, when we use my preverbally, we need to put focus. Focus, again, has alternative-based semantics that, according to a lot of theories, is based on exhaustification, which is basically some sort of conventional implicature, just as the one that I showed you before, okay? All right, so to sum up, why do we get an M400 for NPI violation? And the idea is that these accounts would make the wrong predictions, and this provides a better account. And the idea is that you might actually get N400 triggered by semantic, logical, formal, compositional violations. And this would also help us to explain a lot of unexplained N400, okay? Of course, it sounds very circular because it's very difficult to explain why you get an N400 sometimes and why you don't get it in other circumstances. And of course, it might depend on the task, it might depend on the specific analysis you run and a lot of things. So, it's a problem, and that's why we call them unexplained N400, but still it's food for thought. All right, and then we have this nice idea that actually when you actually add, when you have a negative interpretation of my, or in general of N words in Italian in preverbal position, it is because there is a sort of an imperfection in the system, and through a repair strategy, your parser allows you to insert a cover negation. Okay, right. So yeah, I will stop here. I will take a short break, and I will meet you in five minutes. Okay. So if you have questions, please hold them for a few minutes. Where is my stop button? Yeah, good question. So according to the manual, the LAN is left anterior negativity. So it should be stronger on the left electrodes.
I see.
And whereas the N400, again, according to the manual, is maximum in centroparietal electrodes and a little bit skewed on the right. Okay. So so a lot of people would say yours is not a typical N400, which is fine because it's earlier, right? But the distribution is exactly the same.
I see. Okay.
So the topography is a typical N400, but the latency is a little bit earlier. And in a lot of experiments, especially with function words, you find N400 a little bit earlier. So that's interesting. And then there is the ELAN, right, which only exists in German and in Frederici's lab, which is even earlier than the LAN. So the LAN is about 300 milliseconds, and the ELAN, I think it's like 150 to 200 milliseconds. So it's very difficult to to tease them apart, and many people say it's the same thing. But then a lot of people tend to interpret anterior negativities sorry, N400 as anterior negativities and the other way around. So, you know, and also sometimes they are blended, right? So you have to be very careful at that.
Right.
And yeah, sometimes you, instead of having an N400, which is kind of, you know, coming and going, you have a prolonged anterior negativity. That's quite common. Yeah. So yeah. Okay. Any other question? Cool. So we finally enter into the semantics realm, the real semantics. So let me share this. Yeah. So the plan is that now I will try to introduce these nice studies that I already had talked about in previous editions of this course. And the next time I will finally present some new stuff that I read very recently. So the, you know, the novel part of this course will be the next lecture and the last lecture. Okay. So yeah. So I will try to go a little bit fast with the theoretical. Oh no, don't do this again. What was it? This. Do you see the crazy things? Okay. Yeah. So, right. So starting from the classic model, Wernicke-Geschwin model, right? We're still trying to answer the old question. Where is the concept center? Okay. We might think that now here you have syntax instead of motor images of words. You might think that here you have lexicon instead of auditory images, or along with auditory images of words. Okay. So this is temporal language areas, STS, STG, MTG, posterior MTG, Wernicke's area. This is Broca's area, BA 44, 45, 47. Okay. So where is the concept center? So I'm going to give you an example of a syntactocentric view of language, okay, which is quite familiar in the, let's say, in the Eastern Coast linguistics, especially in the, you know, around Cambridge and these kind of areas, like where Yasu took his PhD, for instance. So the idea is that the basic property of language, of grammar, is merge, right? We have seen that already. Then you have phonology somewhere, and then you have a mapping between your phonology and your syntax, and you have an interface, which could be, for instance, the lexicon, which could be, for instance, Wernicke's area, or STS, STG, now that you are more sophisticated. But then you have your extra linguistic conceptual realm, okay? Your concept, your probably distributed concepts, or whatever the concept center is. We haven't seen that yet. And then you have a mapping between this and grammar. So the semantics, according to a very famous linguist who invented basically modern linguistics, can be thought of as a mapping between grammar and your extra linguistic concepts, okay? So if you are a dog, for instance, you do have concepts. You have concept of food, concept of your mates. You might have some sort of phonology, like dog phonology, right? You react to your name, but you don't have grammar. So that's why you cannot speak a syntactic language, okay? Okay, so that's interesting. So again, phonology might be right here in the big B, sorry, in the big A, right? And also a little bit in the B. Your morphosyntax, Broca's area. And where is the extra linguistic conceptual realm? Everywhere. So this is a study that we're going to mention next time, where they basically found the whole brain active for different words, and they mapped the meaning of these words in different areas of the brain. Good. Might be not a crazy idea, actually. Might be actually an idea which is even endorsed by more grammatically oriented folks like Greg Hickok and David Poppel, which, if you remember, mentioned this idea of having a dorsal stream from a sort of syntax articulatory network in your Broca's area to your sensory motor interface, and then your phonology here, and then you retransmit the information to the temporal lobes, which contain your lexicon, your concepts, and what they call the combinatorial network, which might be, you know, combining concepts together. So, you know, you can have a nice match between the picture that I just showed you, or even a Chomskyan picture of language, and this kind of more modern interactive systems, okay? Good. Now, a possible challenge move to this idea is that semantics, it's not just an interface. It has its own primitives and properties and operations and representations. So if we think in Marian terms, right, we might say that semantics has its own domain of representation, like which are grammar-driven, derived from syntactic structure, abstract, not tied to a specific entity or a sensorial modality, and symbolic. They can be manipulated through logical, mathematical, formal operations. Now, I spared with the review of my paper about this, but if you're interested, I should have posted in Moodle. Okay, and you know the stuff that I explained about NPIs is really sort of referring to these kind of concepts. So, you know, we might say, and a lot of people actually say that in modern linguistics, formal semantics is part of grammar. You have a mapping between syntax and semantics within the grammar, and then you have a mapping between sort of abstract semantics and extralinguistic semantics or extralinguistic concepts. And here your dog, not only it would lack the proper syntax, but also a piece of semantics, okay? All right. So this interface is grammar-driven. These guys have these properties, right? And your question might be, what is the evidence for this? And then I tell you, well, you know, there is a rich ontology of formal models and the rich pattern of localization effect. So if you want to know more about this, have a look at my paper from 2011 or pay attention to what I'm going to tell you in the next slides. So yeah, for instance, we are going to talk about a little bit about this area, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which in the experiments by Lina Pilkanen was often found active for semantic processing. You know already about Haggard's BA4745, which is a little bit more anterior than Broca's area, but it also overlaps with a part of Broca's area, especially BA47, right? Right here. So maybe this is really what is doing this sort of formal semantics job, and then you move out to your real concepts. So, you know, if you really want to answer the question, where is semantics in the brain? Maybe we might say that semantics is kind of shared between grammar on the one side and conceptual extra grammar, extra linguistic stuff on the other side. And it's kind of crossing the two domains. What's the evidence for this? The supremacy of the N400 effect. So the fact that you get N400 for violation of concepts, but also for violation of linguistic rules, okay? Yeah, so all these kind of violations would give you the same neuropsychological effect. So in a way, this might be implemented in a circuit or in a distributed network with different hubs and different processors. And then when you have a problem at any side of this network, you have a generalized response, which is the whole system try to solve the interpretational problem, okay? And we have talked about that already. Right, so this could help at explaining the unexplainable in N400, just like I told you before, by saying, you know, NPI violations are logical clashes, whereas phrase structure violations and agency and thematic role violations, they result in semantic or positional anomalies which affect the N400 component. So this hypothesis actually has been pointed out by Simona Mancini, where she proposed in this paper that you get an N400 when you have a violation of rules, of grammatical rules that are relevant for interpretation, okay? For instance, case marking of agency and thematic roles. Yes, that is relevant for interpretation because these kind of syntactic semantic features are very important for interpreting stuff. But like subject verb number agreement mismatch, not really. It could be important if you really you know, try to have a plural set matching with a singular set, for instance, but you don't always do that. And it's more, it can be considered as a sort of a violation of a formal property of grammar and syntax rather than something that's going to give you a problem at the level of interpretation, because you're going to fix this problem very easily just by changing a syntactic feature, okay? So you don't have to do crazy stuff. If I tell you the children throw, sorry, the child throw, okay, whatever, okay? Right, so the person agreement mismatch would fall within this category, because if you have a person agreement mismatch, then you have problem at the level of interpretation. And that's exactly what she tested. So she compared the person violation and the number violation in Spanish. El cocinero cocinaste un pescado muy rico versus el cocinero cocinaron un pescado muy rico. The cook, third person, singular, cooked, second person, singular. A very tasty fish versus the cook, third person, singular, cooked, third person, singular, a very tasty fish. Okay? And they found N400 for person violation compared to a more frontal negativity, a LAN-like effect for number violation, singular versus plural, okay? And her idea is that you got an N400 here because the person has a dedicated syntactic projection where you have this sort of semantic information about the speech participant, okay? Something that reminds me about the Kamplanian character. Whereas if you have a plural singular agreement violation, it's more about a syntactic feature that can be fixed just by manipulating formal syntactic features, okay? That's her idea. Then, of course, we might, you know, provide counter argument for this idea and say, look, some people found N400 for this. Look, this is not a PIC 600. This is still a frontal negativity. So maybe these are two different kind of semantic violations, but, you know, it was just to give you an interesting hypothesis about this, okay? So the idea is that if you have a participant violation, you have this kind of anchors at the speech level representation. And if you violate that, then you have big problems for interpretation. Okay, so this is something that is very interesting. So another very influential paper about the hypothesis for the origin of the N400, okay? So it's Lau et al. 2008. And yeah, so she compares two views for the N400. The integration view, which says that the N400 reflects the process of semantic integration with the context. What does it mean? It means that you have something to interpret, and then you have a context, and it is difficult to interpret certain things based on the assumption that you make at the level of interpretation due to the context. Classic example, spreading warm butter with socks. You are thinking about spreading butter, and you do not think about doing that with your socks because that's disgusting and you would never do that unless you're crazy, okay? So it is hard to integrate the socks with a spreading context because it is very unlikely, very natural, and very crazy to do that. So the struggle to come up with the crazy idea of spreading butter with socks would be the difficulty of integrating the meaning of the sentence with the context. But then also can be combinatorial in nature. Remember the Dutch trains that are sour, right? You combine sour with train. It's not impossible to combine, but it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Yeah, so previous context, discourse context, shared knowledge or word knowledge about your content words that is retrieved from the long-term semantic memory. So according to this model, you have integration in anterior temporal cortex, left anterior temporal lobe, and we are going to talk about that in the future, okay? Whereas you have some sort of selection and control retrieval in your Broca's area, in the areas near your Broca's area. So BA 44, 45, 47, okay? So the N400 in a way reflects a problem at this level, okay? But there is an alternative explanation, which is kind of compatible, which says that the N400 reflects the facilitated versus difficult access of lexical features that are stored in your lexicon, okay? So this is not combinatorial. The problem that you get N400 for words like spreading butter with socks is that socks was not pre-activated from the preceding words, because if you think about spreading butter, you would never think about socks. And then when you get to socks, you have to activate it from scratch, basically, okay? So that would reflect the lack of a pre-activation. So it's the locus of the effect is purely at the lexical access, okay? So you have a cascade of activation of extralinguistic conceptual information that reflects on the more wide distributed, generation of the wave, but the ignition, the trigger, is lexical. And that you probably find it in your middle temporal gyrus left and your left superior temporal sulcus, okay? So you see, this is a different area compared to your left anterior temporal lobe because they are more anterior, and your Broca's area, okay? So this hypothesis would predict that the N400 is the result of this sort of going back and forth from your Broca's area to your conceptual semantic memory in your anterior temporal cortex, whereas this predicts that no, it's a problem at the lexical access. It's a non-facilitated lexical access in your MTG STS, okay, in your lexicon. Who's right? So the strategy of Lau et al. To come up with the conclusion to settle this debate was to conduct a meta-analysis of priming studies employing short and long latencies, okay? What does it mean? So priming, you might have an idea what it is already from the example of negation, right? So for instance, I can show you a picture of a dog, and then I present you the word animal or the word vehicle. And we know that if you have seen a picture of a dog, you're going to be faster at deciding whether animal is a word or not compared to deciding whether a vehicle is a word or not, or blicket is a word or not, okay? Why is this the case? Or for instance, at naming the target. So you can do the other way around. I can show you the word animal, and then I can show you the picture of a dog, or a picture of a car, you're going to be faster at naming dog when you see animal than at naming dog when you see vehicle. And you're going to be faster at naming the picture of car when you see vehicle compared to when you see an animal. Okay. And all these things has been explained in terms of pre-activation and cascade spreading of activation from your visual areas or your object recognition to your lexicon. Okay. So anytime that you see a car, you automatically pre-activate in your lexicon the lexical item car and also all the sort of sub-members of the domain of cars. Okay. That's quite well known. So what is the latency? The latency is due to the stimulus onset asynchrony, also known as SOA, which basically is the time from the time that passes from when you see the prime, so when you see the picture, for instance, to when you see the target, the picture that you have to name, or the word that you have to read. Okay. So yeah, so basically, again, it's a very, very similar manipulation to the one with negation. You might have this time very, very short, like 30 milliseconds, 150 milliseconds, but you might have this time longer, like 1 second. Why does this matter? Well, it matters in terms of prediction that you might make with respect to the effect of the prime. So if you have very, 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 very short SOA, you see the word and then you see immediately the picture, you predict that this, whatever effect you're going to find, is due to some sort of automatic priming, right? Like an automatic activation that happens immediately. On the other hand, if your SOA is longer than 600 milliseconds, you might have a lot of more overt thinking, for instance, or overt processes coming into play, or some sort of post-lexical processes. For instance, you might start thinking about what kind of words are related to that picture or stuff like this. Okay. So the question is, okay, which one is the area that is sensitive to both latencies, to both short latency and long latency? And she noticed that, if you look at the inferior frontal gyrus, it actually likes long SOA. If you look at your BA37, so your inferotemporal cortex, it's more sensitive to short latencies. Your angular gyrus is not really sensitive to anything. Your temporal parietal conjunction, your temporal poles are sensitive to short latencies. But look, the MTG is sensitive to both. So in all these studies, they found a reduced activation of the MTG for both short latency and long latency of priming. Okay. So whether the distance of the prime and the target was short and long, the MTG was always responding with a reduced activation. Okay, because the priming usually reflects a reduced activation, not an increased activation. Okay, it is reduced because it was pre-activated. Cool. So conclusion, since since at both long latencies and short latencies you get this effect at MTG, and you also get a modulation on the M400. Okay, that's something important that I didn't tell you. In all these studies, you get both modulation on FM400 and fMRI effect. I'm not sure that they all did ERP as well, but you usually get it with standard ERP experiments. So that's not a surprise. So more reduced M400, the more priming you have. So conclusion, it is the MTG. That's the only region sensitive to both SOAs. So the N400 does not reflect post-lexical processes. It really reflects lexical access, immediate lexical access, okay? Of course, they do not deny the effect of integration. That integration with your conceptual and more grammatical areas is very important, but happens later. And my produce subsequent positivities affecting the N400, okay? So if you have these positivities for the for the condition, for the critical condition, that's gonna appear as a larger N400 for the opposite condition, right? Because you always have this problem with ERPs that you never know whether the effect that you find is a positivity in one condition or a negativity in the opposite condition, right? Because you're always comparing two conditions at the same time. Right. So their claim is that yes, the N400, sorry, your left anterior temporal cortex, so your Broca's area, is not the main generator. The main generator is really the MTG, is your lexical storage and lexical processor. And there they have this nice model where you can also appreciate the localization of these areas. So see, this is your middle temporal gyrus. This is your anterior temporal cortex. So this is where you have, for instance, many aspects of your semantic memory, like for instance, the concept of specific individuals or specific concepts. If you have semantic dementia, you have a progressive damage or progressive degeneration of this area, then you have a localized deficit at naming specific entities, specifically specific objects, but not tools or autobiographical memories, for instance, okay? So this might be one important part of the network of the concepts. And this is your lexicon. And this is your Broca's area, which acts as a sort of a controller. So the MTG is a storing of the lexical representation and also what controls the access to this representation from the lexical point of view. But it's your anterior inferior frontal gyrus, so your BA47 and a piece of 45, who controls the retrieval of this lexical representation from the lexical based on top-down information. So based on, for instance, on contextual information, or based on words that you have already read in the sentence. Whereas your Broca's area mediates the selection of these highly activated representations. So if you have a lot of lexical representations that are activated, your Broca's area is going to say, okay, I'm going to pick this one because this is relevant for, grammatically relevant for the words that I have to compose, okay? And yeah, and your anterior temporal poles act as an integrator of incoming information into current contextual and syntactic representation. Okay, that's one of these problems about this model is that it's kind of vague, right? Because you always have these words like integration, control, integration, storing, but it's not clear, for instance, to me, what is the difference between integrating between context and syntax and mediating the selection of things that are highly activated between context and syntax, okay? So we are going to talk a little bit more in detail about these things, but it's quite clear what the role of the lexicon is, right? Okay, so additional problem of these models, for instance, is that it does not explain very well the difference between semantic composition and conceptual composition, okay? So from composing the meaning of two words and composing the meaning of two concepts. And also, I have this problem about using the term combinatorial for contextual integration. Okay. So you might process two concepts together and integrate two concepts together using some sort of analog like extra linguistic processing. If I tell you a red cat, you have to build up a mental image of a cat and paint it red. And that's different from composing the quantifier every with the noun cat, right? Right. And, it might account for just a part of the story. So it might focus on all these effects that give you an N400 for lexical access problems, like words that are not predictable from the context, right? But it doesn't explain a wide range of grammatical N400, like the one that I showed you. And it doesn't explain why certain syntactic anomalies do elicit N400 and other syntactic anomalies don't, right? And it doesn't explain, for instance, in the experiment that I just showed you, why cases in which lexical items are highly active, like none occurring right before my, right, still do not suppress the N400. In fact, we got the highest N400 in that case. Okay? Well, you might say, if you have none, then you would never activate my. That is true. But then, even if you don't have none, you would not activate my, but you would activate it a little bit more because it is in a position which is grammatical, right? Which is, pre-verbal position. So you would never expect a greater N400 for an unlicensed my compared to a my licensed in the wrong position. And it does not highlight the specificity of the Broca's area for linguistic and syntactic processing. So it's not clear how to integrate this kind of model with more Groczynski, Frederici, Zaccarella's like approaches that say that you have merge, for instance, in BA44. Okay, what's the relationship between merge and mediating the activation of lexical representation? And yeah, and he doesn't say anything about the interplay between the N400 and other well-known components, such as the P600, frontal and posterior. So it's just focused on the N400. But yeah, it's it's an interesting idea. Okay. So we ran a little bit out of time. So I think I would stop here. I didn't manage to talk about everything that I wanted to talk about, but we went quite far. So I'm actually quite happy. Yeah, so if there is any question related to what we talked about, I'd be happy to answer you now, or we can hold it for tomorrow. Any question? So I guess we can call it a day. Sorry, not tomorrow, but the next class will be on the 26th. So Friday. Okay. So Friday, we will continue talking about semantic processing, and I will start introducing some other components of what I call the semantic network. Okay. In particular, this ATL that I talked about, the angular gyrus, and other very, very fancy parts of our brain. So have a nice day and see you on Friday. See you.